Okay, because I'm less important to the visual.
Yeah, then actually, maybe we can sit over there and I'll just sit on this side so that we can both see the presentation as well.
Opposite of each other.
Yeah.
Oh, I need to put the mic.
Oh.
This is the clicker. So you guys will keep your clickers, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You're the
yeah.
only one presenting.
Yeah, I think so.
Why don't you just keep it with you?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Right?
You give me way too much power.
So we speak in the mics there, or we speak? Oh, the mic is here also. Yeah, the mic here. Let's speak from here. Yeah. Sorry, guys, for getting a few minutes late to get the logistics organized. When Owing Roman asked me to moderate this panel, he knew very well I'm not a demographer. I'm trained as a health anthropologist. And part of the reason he asked me to do this, because we are engaged in an exercise among a group of us to question the measure of unmet need and its validity in the future of family planning. I don't aim to make that the focus of the debate amongst a bunch of demographers who are dedicated to the measurement, but I hope we can give the last 5 minutes for some provocative conversation on what would we do differently if we had to start this exercise in the future. So just on that opening note, I'm going to ask each of the presenters to introduce themselves and tell us one thing that you are excited about for this panel. Yeah.
Sure. So my name is Mahesh Kara. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University. And I kind of got into this debate around unmet need through multiple channels. And what I'm excited about is actually thinking more critically about the role of preferences. Because as you will probably see in my presentation, I take it out of the equation in my proposal for unmet needs. So, and that's a pretty significant and possibly even controversial approach, but I think it's one that's worth having, a debate worth having. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Vladimíra Kantorová. I work in the United Nations Population Division. I will not be presenter, but I will answer the questions because I'm co-author of one of the papers which Jonathan Bírek from the Guttmacher Institute will present. And so what I'm excited about is the discussion with an economist about unmet need for family planning. No, but it's also what I am also excited is just exploring the ways how we can still use unmet need for family planning indicator in the current times. So thank you.
Are the people who are joining virtually able to hear us? And if they are there, can they introduce themselves? Anyone is up on the line? I don't think so, right? Jonathan, can you hear us?
Hello. Good morning to those of you in Thailand, and good evening to myself. My name is Jonathan Bírek. I'm a sociologist with the Guttmacher Institute in New York. This talk is about alignment between desires and outcomes among women wanting to avoid pregnancy.
Thanks, Jonathan. And
Women's ability to prevent pregnancy, should they so desire, is, along with access to safe abortion, necessary to achieve the goal of all women successfully exercising the right to determine whether and when to have children. Unintended pregnancy is also widely associated with adverse health outcomes. And for these reasons, estimates of the incidence of unintended pregnancy have helped civil society organizations and governments understand and communicate the population prevalence of unintended pregnancy and mobilize resources in sexual and reproductive health care. Now, rates of unintended pregnancy have declined over the last 30 years in all world regions, with the magnitudes of these declines varying considerably. These trends help reveal where progress has occurred in improving women's capacity to prevent unintended pregnancy, and where further progress is required to achieve the goal of all women successfully exercising the right to decide freely the number and spacing of their children. However, This rate, as it's conventionally constructed, isn't well suited to estimating women's success in avoiding unintended pregnancies. This is for the simple reason that the denominator includes women who do not want to avoid pregnancy. Unintended pregnancy rates have as their denominator all women of reproductive age. Hence, when the proportion of women who want to avoid an unintended pregnancy increases, the conventional unintended pregnancy rate increases, all else equal. Since the proportion of women who want to become pregnant differs between populations and changes over time, this complicates the interpretation of comparisons across populations and analysis of time trends. So we propose an alternative measure which relates the number of unintended pregnancies to the number of women at risk of pregnancy who reported wanting to stop or space childbearing. We term this the conditional unintended pregnancy rate. We refer to the conventional measure as the corresponding unconditional rate. The conditional rate may be expressed as the ratio of the number of unintended pregnancies to the number of women of reproductive age wanting to avoid pregnancy times 1,000. Alternatively, you can divide the unconditional rate by the proportion wanting to avoid pregnancy. Our measure relies on existing survey data, and it's based on widely used indicators. For the numbers of unintended pregnancies, we use the estimates released earlier this year by the Guttmacher Institute in collaboration with the World Health Organization. For the numbers of women wanting to avoid pregnancy, we employ the definitions developed for contraceptive need and use, which we obtained from the United Nations. This bar chart shows you conditional unintended pregnancy rates for Sustainable Development Goal subregions. These are estimated as yearly averages in the 5-year time period of 2015 through 2019. Rates are estimated as 5-year averages, but I want to be clear, these are year-specific average rates. So rates per 1,000 women per year who want to avoid becoming pregnant. Across all subregions, conditional rates ranged from 35 in Western Europe to 258 in Middle Africa. This 258 per 1,000 rate, that corresponds to a rate of 1 unintended pregnancy per 4 women who want to avoid pregnancy per year. Although conditional rates were generally greatest in African subregions, the subregions in Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean also exhibited substantially greater rates in comparison to Europe. Conditional rates in European subregions, with the exception of Eastern Europe, were greatest in Northern Europe, where the rate was 47. In contrast, the smallest subregional rate in Latin America and the Caribbean was found in Central America at 99. While the smallest rates among Asian subregions were in Central Asia and Eastern Asia at 76 and 82 respectively. And the smallest rate among African subregions was 138 in Southern Africa. That is, the conditional rates in European subregions, excepting Eastern Europe, they were about a third to a half the rate found in the smallest subregions, a third to a half of the smallest rate among the subregions within Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Africa. Moreover, in Southern Asia, where the conditional rate was 129, and in the Caribbean, where the conditional rate was 137, women wanting to avoid pregnancy were nearly 4 times as likely to become pregnant as those in Western Europe. In Middle Africa, women wanting to avoid pregnancy were 7 times as likely to experience unintended pregnancy each year than women in Western Europe. This is a map showing you conditional unintended pregnancy rates for 150 countries and territories. Now, the regional averages you just saw, those were based on estimates we produced for 195 countries, but country-specific estimates can be publicly released for 150 of these countries. That's why, for example, Western Asia and Northern Africa are grayed out on this map. Now, looking at these 150 countries, you can see substantial variation between them, including within the same subregions. In Western Europe, where rates were generally smallest, they range from 25 in the Netherlands to 42 in France. In Middle Africa, where rates were generally greatest, they range from 188 in Congo to 283 in Angola. Here you can see the conditional and unconditional rates on the same chart. The conditional rates are blue as before, and the unconditional rates are orange. Whereas the conditional rate in Middle Africa was 7.3 times greater than the same rate in Western Europe, the unconditional rate was 4.5 times greater comparing these subregions. This plot quantifies the extent to which unintended pregnancy rates, as conventionally estimated, have overstated the alignment between women's reproductive objectives and outcomes. Conventional rates have also understated the disparities between countries and between regions. Comparing yearly average rates in the early 90s to the most recent time period that we were able to produce estimates for, we can see that subregions which saw declines in rates generally saw more substantial proportionate declines in conditional rates. So this chart is showing you percentage change. Just for example, conditional rates declined 3.0 to 6.7 times more than unconditional rates in Middle Eastern and Western Africa. They also declined 1.4 to 1.6 times more than unconditional rates in Southeastern Asia and in Latin American subregions. Thus, trends in unconditional rates substantially underestimated the increases in alignment between preferences and outcomes among women trying to avoid pregnancy in the subregions of Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as in Southeastern Asia and Oceania. This means that the conventional measure has greatly understated the increases since the 1990s in women's success in preventing unintended pregnancy. And it's done this the most in the subregions in which unintended pregnancy rates are presently greatest. So, in comparison with existing measures, conditional unintended rates better represent the differences across groups of countries in how well pregnancy preferences correspond to experiences of pregnancy. Conventional rates have concealed stark global disparities in the ability of women to avoid unintended pregnancies. And they've also understated progress in regions where the fraction of women wanting to avoid pregnancy has increased. Now, the conditional unintended pregnancy rate could additionally be compared with and used to complement SDG indicator 371, the proportion of reproductive age women who have their need for family planning satisfied with modern methods. Conditional rates reflect trends in the use of more effective methods of contraception and more efficacious use of these methods. Additionally, as some women wanting to avoid pregnancy may not want to use modern contraceptives or any method, the conditional unintended pregnancy rate is arguably more closely aligned with women's preferences. In closing, I'll leave you with this thought. Determining freely the number and spacing of one's children has been recognized as a fundamental human right. The conditional unintended pregnancy rate provides a more accurate assessment of women's success at the population level in exercising this right. Thank you for your time. And of course, I'd also like to thank our donors, the Gates Foundation and the Norwegian Agency for Development Corporation, for providing funding for this work. Thank you so much.
So this is a video recording. We cannot get answers of Jonathan, but we have a colleague here who's going to answer the questions. So let's open it up for discussion, questions, perspectives. Go ahead, please. I mean, I can be the mic man. Oh, you have mic?
Yeah,
Okay,
that should,
great.
hello? Yeah. Hi, I'm Dana from the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs, and I really appreciated the presentation and the limitations and the typical measure. There's also some conversations that I've heard in meetings like this about the concept of intended and unintended pregnancy overall, just whether that's relevant, where's the space for pregnancy ambivalence and some of those nuances. And I was just wondering if we could talk about that within this sort of the framing of this measure as well.
Any other questions, perspectives?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, in similar vein to the question that Dana just asked, I was trying to think about, because you're trying to understand dynamics over time, thinking about how preferences and intentions made, like, as they are measured, and we have cross-sectional data that are often limited, and I'll be discussing a little bit about that, but like how those are actually stable or changing over time actually would affect the relative numerator as well as denominator in intention. And so thinking, what would be construed as an unintended pregnancy as it was measured, 5 years ago, may be very different, and with a different type of woman, especially as modern contraception and contraceptive trends are also changing simultaneously. So just trying to disentangle the interaction between pregnancy and intention and contraceptive availability. If we could speak a little bit about that, would be great. Yeah.
So just to add to that question, right? So when those of you remember Mike Koenig, and when he did these surveys following up the same women within a year's time and compared responses and their pregnancies or not getting pregnancy outcomes, what they saw was that even amongst those who intended to use contraception or said they were using contraception, they actually ended up with pregnancies, but did not describe them as unintended pregnancies.
Yeah.
So we also have to grapple with just those kinds of things. And that in part is what provokes the question, do we need to go beyond and find a new construct that becomes more meaningful for programming? Because right now this construct has largely seemed to serve the advocacy purpose, right, of making the case of why governments and why donors need to invest more, right? But it is not helping us to understand what is the quality of change and the depth or the range of change.
Yeah, if I could quickly finger on that, because you're not following up women in the same woman, it's not a panel of
Yes.
individual women, but the measures are constructed as a panel, the variation and stability of preferences over time are just unknown. And so when you think about how there may be a lot of ex post rationalization, hypothetical bias that come in, if women who end up getting pregnant it's a rare woman who would say that her pregnancy was unintended after she got pregnant. Unless,
Yeah.
but that's how we're trying to understand it in a concept. And so thinking about that change of state, is something that we should all grapple with, I think. Yeah.
Okay, another question. Yeah.
I guess just adding to this conversation. So Paul Bornshaw from PSI, have you seen or do you anticipate any geographical differences in the way that women respond to these questions as well? Because I think the presentation did a great job of demonstrating geographic differentials. To what extent is that a measurement issue rather than a preference issue?
thank you for all these questions. I think we are really getting already after that first presentation in the depth of the issues. And so one of the issues which I will start from the beginning, this is really a population level indicator. And I think it's very important to understand we need to use the unmet need for family planning indicator always as a population level indicator and use it for the correct purposes, correct interpretations. And we cannot find everything what we want to find in that indicator because that indicator is not constructed for all this what we want to assign to it. So that said, at the beginning of the paper, we actually have a kind of a historical overview looking at the kind of development of these indicators. And some of them, one of the first applications is actually on the fertility in the United States, understanding whether it's the preferences or the contraceptive use. And it starts at the population level indicators. But then very soon in the 1980s, I think with the NSFG surveys, it starts to go to the individual level. And there really the issue of how individuals are shifting from one situation to another, what changes in their preferences, became so difficult to analyze at the individual level that actually these studies are quite rare to being able to follow the changes of the individuals in sufficiently small periods of the time that we see the, and this is something at the individual level. Our study is everything at the population level. So it's really looking at the population level changes. And one of the main issues which we want to address is the differences between the populations in the fertility and fertility desires, which are preferences, which are changing over time. And the previous indicators failed to address it or taken into account. So, I mean, even for us, it was striking to realize that among women who want to avoid pregnancy in Western and Middle Africa, it's every year one of four women is becoming pregnant. So it's something which suddenly that difference between the Europe and the developed parts of the world and Sub-Saharan Africa is becoming very clear. And then here I would like to address the last question. So we were discussing how much when most of the population actually has a high fertility preferences and large part of the population want to become pregnant of the women. So how this is different as a population to the population of European countries where most of the women, most of their reproductive lives are actually trying to prevent pregnancies. So that's kind of like we need to really understand more how with this population change, what actually the preferences are happening. But really the main argument, which I think might be after a while a boring answer from me, it's that this is really population level analysis. Yeah. And I think sometimes what maybe Mahesh will present completely, the different view, and I'm looking forward to it.
I also exactly ascribe to the population. I mean, we forget that as a population level average, it's a population statistic that estimates a population parameter, and you commit ecological fallacies. Like first things that we learn in statistics, you commit ecological fallacies by ascribing a population level parameter to individual level behavior. And that is a tendency in the field. Yeah.
And I think the problem is also, for instance, in the way how SDG indicator is worded, because it's the proportion of women of reproductive age in need of family planning who are using the modern contraceptive method. So immediately we think that that proportion is actually individual level. And it still need to keep in mind this is population level indicator.
And also that it sometimes slips into the language of there's demand.
Yeah.
Right? So let's move on to Mahesh.
Sure.
Just people came in late. The next panelist is just a recording. Not that Dr. Aparna Jain is a brilliant demographer and thinker, but we won't be able to have questions and answers with her presentation. So we just do that at the end and rather have a good dialogue with those who are in the room.
Great. I think I can. I think I'm able to click from here, or is that? Should I? Oh, it's on. Maybe. Second. Oh, yeah, it's on. Am I supposed to click from here? Sorry. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no problem.
You want to start up and set up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I think the main premise of this idea is around my grappling with the idea of preferences and how problematic preferences are when we incorporate them into these measures. And being an economist and thinking about, I mean, just how definitionally and operationally we think about preferences being so distinct from terminology, that terminology that non-economists, particularly in demography and family planning, use it, we find this metric extremely problematic. And I mean, even in our discussion like so far, we've used the terms pregnancy desires, pregnancy intentions, pregnancy preferences, and pregnancy like beliefs. And when we think about how we operationalize them through data, they're all using the same metric. So I'm wondering, are all these 4 latent constructs all being used with one indicator or with one metric? A thought. I'll just leave this thought out as I start. So I don't think I need to convince the room like what unmet need is here, because we've all thought about this extensively. But just to recap, it's a proportion of women who want to delay or stop childbearing but are not using contraception. And we do not need to understate in the International Conference of Family Planning what a significant role this indicator has played in research, advocacy, program evaluation, funding, etc. And it's I would argue it's probably the most widely known indicator in family planning reproductive health outside of contraceptive prevalence. I'm not going to say that it seems to be more conceptually straightforward because we've been grappling with it for years, but like the intention, like the original premise of the indicator is, like the motivation behind it is relatively clear. How we actually think about operationalizing and measurement has been the source of the debate and why we're here today. And it's undergone multiple revisions in throughout its history. And I just put the definition, the latest definition by Sarah Bradley and colleagues that we operationalized through the DHS, where it's women of reproductive age who want to space or limit births for at least 2 or more years and who are not using contraception. So implicitly, you've already linked a fertility-related outcome, so fertility preferences, to contraceptive preferences, assuming a mapping between fertility preferences to contraceptive preferences to contraceptive behavior. And that is a pretty strong assumption to make, and that's my critique in this approach. I can go on for 3 more hours about all the methodological and operational criticisms of this metric over the years, but my main problem that I'm going to focus on today, which is the motivation behind my proposal, is the reliance on stated fertility preferences. I mean, we just had a conversation with Vladimira about like what does stated preferences mean over populations, the retrospective recall problem. At the time you became pregnant with this child, did you want to become pregnant? Did you want to wait, not having any more children? It's a rare woman and a rare couple that would say that the last child was unwanted. So the ex post rationalization bias, well known. Even if you try to correct it with hypothetical framings or prospective framings in a cross section, it doesn't solve the problem. It actually may even make it worse. Would you like to have another child? It's anchored on current parity, it's anchored on current states of the world and states of environment, and stated ideal number of children. This, again, hypothetical bias. If you could go back in time before you had any children, how many children would you want? Any of these metrics to operationalize these ideas on preferences all come with severe limitations. And I'm not sure to what extent these are I just presented on methods like fertility preference stability. Women change their minds all the time for very good reasons. And none of this, so even eliciting some metric, we always try to think about it, is it imperfect and is it imperfect enough? But is it still good enough? I think that we're trying to put lipstick on the pig and we need to move past that point. So my main critique is biased measures of preferences, which only would yield, at best, biased measures of unmet need, and we're not even clear about the direction of the bias. This is not like attenuation bias. This is like the direction and the magnitude are actually quite unknown to us. So I'm thinking about the counterfactual approach, where I go back to the original, thinking about the original thoughts or premises behind unmet need. So I leave this, given the conceptual and operational challenges, I just wanted to talk about what the intention or the aim of the measure was. And I would like to propose this question, which is, what would the contraceptive prevalence, what would contraceptive prevalence and behavior look like in a perfectly contraceptive society, What do I mean by a perfectly contraceptive society? A society where women and couples have full, free, informed choice, are perfectly reproductively and contraceptively empowered to make the choices to use or not to use contraception, whether it be for fertility reasons, for contraceptive reasons, for other reasons. The reasons and the sources of use or non-use are a second order, but that idea, that state of the world, we're comparing states of the world, counterfactuals. And so if we think about that state of the world, where we have a perfectly contracepting society in a state of the world with this environment, and how is it different? What is that prevalence? How is that different from what we experience in today's status quo? That difference between the ideal state of the world and the current state of the world in these two prevalences, if they were both measurable, is unmet need. So with that thought, I propose this thought experiment, this counterfactual thought experiment for unmet need. So we define the current contraceptive prevalence, and I'm using, just for all the demographers out here, I'm using it as a contraceptive prevalence and not a contraceptive prevalence rate, because rates include person time or time as a denominator, and we confuse, and any epidemiologist here would immediately rap us over the knuckles for using rates incorrectly. So it's a prevalence as a proportion of women in a country, a country or a geography at a time, at a specific time, who are using contraception in the current state of the world. This is something that we often measure as the first, that's the first indicator. Now I define ideal contraceptive prevalence as a proportion of women who use contraception in the state of the world where women's family planning and fertility preference can be achieved without constraints. What do I mean without constraints? There are no barriers, costs, constraints to both identify, and I'm talking not only supply side, I'm talking demand side, I'm talking social norms, no social constraints, social stigma. Think about like the ideal state of the world, whatever this is, and however we conceptualize it and theorize it, for women and couples to be able to identify and realize their preferences for contraception. So this idea of full, free, and informed choice, the realization of full, free, and informed choice with contraceptive and reproductive autonomy. Unmet need, if we were able to identify both these prevalences, is just the difference of the two. So under this definition, measuring contraceptive prevalence, all measurement error aside, is relatively more straightforward. Measuring ideal contraceptive prevalence is more challenging. In an ideal environment, the observed contraceptive prevalence would actually, in the economic sense, reveal a woman's preference through her observed contraceptive behavior. So what I'm doing is kind of flipping the question on its head a little bit and saying, let's identify the ideal environment. Who are women who would approximate this ideal environment where they have more autonomy and are able to make empowered decisions over contraceptive use, whether they choose to or don't choose to? And if we are able to do this, we can estimate unmet need without any use for biased preference data. It's a direct observed realization. There's nothing about measuring intention, pregnancy preferences, fertility preferences. It's all stepped back. So the question is now, how do we identify women who are part of this ideal state of the world, this ideal environment? So we need to identify, the way that I propose is identify within the population the subsample of women who, based on their characteristics, reflect a higher, converge to the ideal contraceptive and reproductive empowerment state. So it's a similar approach, by the way, that we use in child health and other metrics in maternal and child health, where when you say growth standards, let's compare children who are stunted. Who are you comparing those children against? You're comparing those children against those children who are part of this ideal state. Like this is how children should have grown if they had all the investments, if they were from the best backgrounds, if they had all the available access, information, investments to be able to grow as children would. It's the same idea, but just paralleled in family planning. So what I do is I estimate unmet need from about 56 countries with 80 DHS surveys, about 2 million women, and I identify the sample of ideal women from environments where women are belonging to the highest socioeconomic status, so best wealth quintile in this axis, which also proxies for best access. I'm using the same selection for married or sexually active that the current metric of unmet need uses. attained as at least a tertiary school of education. So this is an idea of thinking about better information and access and being able to actually realize and act on their contraceptive preferences. They know of at least one contraceptive method. So this is about information. These are women who are more informed than possibly the average status quo. And they don't report distance. And these are all metrics that are used in DHS survey data that we can observe and that we can realize. I have a total of about 6 variables that I've identified so far. So the actual data requirement is quite small. If I select the subsample, note that I go from about 2 million women to about 55,000 women who meet these criteria, who live in these states of the world. So that's about 2.7% of the total full sample that I have. So when I compare, these are just descriptive statistics. What I see is that if you compare contraceptive use in my sample of 2 million women to contraceptive use among the 55,000 women across all these countries, it's about an 18% difference in contraceptive prevalence. We can also compare all these other characteristics, and like a lot of these characteristics are quite mechanical, even if I've not selected on them. These women who've been selected from these environments are pretty well off. And so their choice whether to use or whether to not use is more reflective of their contraceptive autonomy. I'm approximating contraceptive autonomy in this state. Notice in selecting this top 2% of women, we don't have 100% contraceptive use. So just want to also note that these women, it's not that every woman is actually using contraception. If I compare my metric of unmet need with the other traditional methods of unmet need, I find that my method of unmet need and this definition predicts higher unmet need, but there's also a lot more variation across countries, whereas a lot of countries actually have up to 30% percentage points higher than the traditional approach and up to 20 percentage points lower as well. So this is actually just plotting the distribution of unmet need in my metric with the current definitions, which are in blue and green, against the metric that I propose, which is in red. And this is the difference, just plotting the differences. So here's a real conceptual challenge for us. If I had infinite sample, then the subsample of women who I could predict, like who I can select to be from the highest empowered, who are able to exercise their preferences, would also be infinite. I'm unfortunately restricted by sample size because I'm going down to 55,000 out of 2 million. That's already very restrictive. And so the problem that we would have is that in large populations, the subsample of women from ideal environments should, in theory, be representative of women from the full sample on non-modifiable characteristics. So they should not be different by age, religious, ethnicity, because if they are, I'm doing a very problematic thing where I'm comparing, for example, ethnic minority women to ethnic majority women, which reflect different states of empowerment. And that type of modifiable characteristic should be adjusted for sure. And this is where we have an issue with data and what can we do with data and sample size. So what I do is I use matching methods, like to be able to adjust based on observable data within each DHS survey, within each country and year. I match women from ideal environments with women from the general population based on characteristics that I don't think that women, that are not changeable, that we cannot necessarily affect, including socioeconomic status, education, where we believe that women can achieve higher echelons in these contexts. I recalculate unmet need this way, and I don't see many differences. It's still, the distribution is wider, but we see a little bit more of a convergence on the mean. So just to conclude, what I'd like to say is that it's been a key indicator. The metric holds significant programmatic weight, and it's also significantly biased as we currently measure it. And the direction of the bias is not clear. In thinking about the conceptualization of unmet needs differently and also trying to operationalize it, what I'm trying to say is that we can approach a counterfactual measure that can be more consistently applied over time across countries, across surveys. And by the way, you can also do this at the sub-regional level if you believe that those comparisons are better. All we need is just the data. If we have enough sample, we should be able to have enough power to be able to find these ideal environment women compared to women from the status quo, from the average woman. Estimating unmet needs through the lens of the following question: and what is desirable contraceptive coverage in this ideal environment? this is what I think my metric is better, which is it's conceptually appealing, it's independent of biases from any stated or reported preferences. I say nothing about stated preferences. I let the data and behavior speak for itself. It's simple to derive. It only requires 68 DHS questions, and the more you can include, the larger the sample, the more you can select on. And it's flexible to be used for cross-country comparisons, time series, and also can be done more context-specific. So if you want to go down to the disaggregated regional level, the district level, it's all is fair game. It just depends on data availability. And I want to emphasize, I think I may have taken this from Vladimir as she was talking and changed the slide. It's a point level, it's a preference, it's a population level point preference. And it should be used as such. It should not be used for inference at a disaggregated, meaning individual level, where unmet need should never be on the right-hand side of a variable, right-hand side of an equation as an individual level metric. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Before we take questions, I want to ask the technical team, has a fourth person signed into this yet, or is anyone else who's speaking online? I guess not. So let's open up to questions from the audience. Yes, just introduce yourself and speak. Gentleman in the front here. Yeah.
Hi, Mahesh. My name's Dan. So my question is, do you know the rank correlation between your new measure and the previous measure? Because while it's worthwhile to measure properly, if your new measure is just a monotonic transformation of the previous measure, it's a little bit confusing about what the policy relevance is.
Yeah, so it's not monotonically, it's not a monotonic transformation because you actually see both negative correlation as well as positive correlation, and it's all country specific, like where in some countries the differences are positive, and some countries the differences are negative. And actually, one thing to just note, in my metric, unmet need can be negative. So you can actually calculate where the current contraceptive prevalence from the average sample can actually be higher than the contraceptive prevalence in the ideal subsample from women whom we consider to be more reproductively or contraceptively empowered, which is going to tell you something about, I'll leave the interpretation to the audience, what that means. But yeah, the rank, it's not a monotonic transformation. It's not rank correlated in that way. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm another Mahesh here. I just have one question because, thank you so much for this introducing new measures of unmet need, which we are debating for a long time for correct measurement. The definition you have used, basically the 5 kind of component you have used for these new measures. I'm thinking about whether we need to consider one important element there, which is informed choice. Because in many circumstances, women may not have kind of the method they want, in many situations. So what do you think, whether the informed choice of the method should be included in your definitions, in that 5 definitions or not, and why? Thanks.
Absolutely. So I think the question is that how do we observe what informed choice would look like in the data that we are given? Because again, we are working in an environment where we have data constraints and we need to be able to observe or estimate in the most unbiased way possible a metric, a population level metric with observable data. And I'm not going to go the preference route, but we have to try to approximate what informed choice looks like. I am more than happy to debate, and I think that it's important to have a debate on which 5 indicators we use to generate and select the sample of women who we believe have more informed or approximating and converging to informed choice. I pick wealth, education, access, physical access, information, whether they have more information, and marital status, right? Sorry, not marital status, but sexual activity, and that's just to get the right denominator to make it a comparison with the current definition. We can add more. I definitely think that it's this metric and this approach is flexible to adding 20, 30, 40, as many as we'd like indicators to select these women who we believe approximate approximate contraceptively empowered women. The question is it's a sample consideration, because every time you add another variable and an indicator to select on, you're just reducing or you're cutting your sample down. So I think it's an important question to have, and actually what you find, and actually I did some sensitivity and robustness checks that I did not show, is that the first three actually select, they can constitute the biggest bulk of selection. Socioeconomic status, educational attainment, none of this is surprising to this audience, right? Socioeconomic status, educational attainment, and information, pretty much like, there's very little extra variation that is like cut away and explained if you add more variables. But this method is open to, and it's flexible to be modified in that sense. I think the main question that we have to ask is that, are we satisfied with how the choice, the theory behind the choosing of the variables to identify the contraceptively empowered subsample? That's my proposition, I guess, to the field. Think about that.
Yes, I see more hands up. Yes, right there in front. And then next, yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I heard the presentation at PAA already, but I still have one more question. Like,
Yes.
I really try to wrap my head around this. So, for instance, you were just saying that your indicator is really narrowed down to that three component, especially socioeconomic status, education, and wealth. But then I wonder if like there's this like paradox in a lot of low and middle income countries wherein the highest, especially your education is looking at beyond secondary education, like the paradox in which like women with super high socioeconomic status, more income, and highest education is actually viewed by the society as a threat to men's status, so that those women are actually experiencing, like by a lot of empirical studies, for instance, things like higher risk of violence. I don't know, I'm not well informed if contraceptive use is also a outcome of that kind of paradoxical observation, but yeah, I don't know whether if your study has considered that situation, and also what like like the gender power. I understand that the power autonomy is not a measure in all DHS, but then since your sample is looking at currently married women, I wonder if at least you have already checked husband's education to look at the relative status between men and women to see if the power dynamics might have misestimated your highest possible achievable contraceptive preference. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think this is a really great point, and I would like to say that the metrics, the selection of indicators that I selected was based on literature from a wide range of literature that says that these are indicators that correlate to higher empowerment. What does higher empowerment mean? It means that if, like in the case of education, these women have there are many we see correlations around the world where the highest educated women in the highest educated echelons of a population actually have lower contraceptive prevalence than the average, right? The question we have to ask is that because women, in this model, what we're saying is that those highest educated women have the choice whether or not they're revealing their preference to say that they had the choice to be empowered to say they want to use or not want to use, and they're choosing not to, right? If it's the case that education is actually disempowering, that's what we're getting at. It's saying that if education is not the right selecting variable, what you actually are saying is that education is actually disempowering, either in a subsample or in the population, to women's contraceptive choice and reproductive choices. So I'm open, and actually I'm not the expert on what are the structural determinants of empowerment, but I actually also did decision making. So I actually looked into decision making, saying like women who have like decision making whether or not to use contraception. I also put that in, and it doesn't change the selection that much. But so it's not terribly sensitive to that metric once you include education and socioeconomic status. But the point is like we have to be, this is a debate for the practitioners and the folks who are applying this method to say, what are the, we're reframing it differently. We're saying what do we believe are the determinants of contraceptive empowerment and contraceptive choice? If it's not education, then we have to think of another alternative or set of indicators that actually allow us to identify women who we believe are more contraceptively empowered.
Okay, let's take some more questions. Yes. Okay, whoever is closer to the mic, just come up and just wait and just take. Let's take 2 or 3 questions together.
I'm happy to do that.
Bundle the answers.
Yeah.
Michelle Weinberger with Avenir Health.
Hi.
Thanks. I think many of us in this room are probably in that ranks of people who are dissatisfied with unmet needs. So nice to see coming at it in a different way. I guess as you were talking about your theoretical idea of it, I kind of maybe was envisioning in my head sort of like a short-term, long-term issue, right? And we're thinking about measuring need as in the current society that people live in and the norms that they live in and breaking out of that. But I wonder, to what degree do you think even kind of selecting that that subset of women still live in an environment that might still be limiting in many ways? And like, is there, I don't know, just thinking about like, what is that, so in a conservative society with norms that might be affecting and economic opportunities, all of those things that are influencing all these choices, even getting to that subset of women might still be a far way from that longer term. And I'm just curious about like the variation you see across countries, and is there some like global convergence of this in a kind of truly open, free society?
Let's hear a couple of.
I'm going to wait
Go
because
ahead.
that's a great point. Yeah.
Hi, Beth Sully from the Guttmacher Institute. I had 2 questions, and one sort of follows on Michelle's nicely, which is how much this be a country-specific measure? When you were talking about changing those indicators, how much the ideal contracepting group might vary across countries, and maybe we don't want to be doing any cross-country comparison because of that, but then will that actually provide a suitable alternative to unmet need if we aren't able to do cross-country comparisons and monitor trends over time? So I think we have to think about like, we all agree we need to fix unmet need, but what have we used it for, and will this measure allow us to do the same thing? So that's the first one. And the second one I think is this idea of the ideal contracepting group in a society. When you're talking about like empowerment, and it's just framed around contraceptive choice, and I think we have to think about the range of choices that people have. And one of the reasons we might see higher levels of traditional method use among sort of higher SES women could be that they also have control over all of the other factors that shape their method preference. So they have control over when to have sex and who their partners are, and that larger choice environment could constrain what methods are available to them. So this negative unmet need, but this is sort of what's like in my head is that possible, or does it create this false dichotomy of like, that the choice for the ideal, like the most empowered women might look different than the choice for less empowered women because of their environment that they are in and the methods that best suit that environment, and if this creates sort of an unrealistic comparison for them.
Totally. So, can I answer both of them?
Sure,
Because they're actually linked. So I think that like when you're talking, I mean, that's exactly right. And what we're actually limited by is data in some ways. Because like I would love to have data on socioeconomics, like the sociocultural environment, where if you want to, because the ideal comparison is that we're actually controlling for or adjusting for if I had the data, it would be like comparing women who we would consider from the status quo with the same woman from the same environment, but who actually has all, like who actually would be, whom we would identify as contraceptively empowered. And on a side note, I'm not sure we would actually like sometimes even recognize the contraceptively empowered woman if we were even to be able to see her. Like, what does she even look like, and how do we conceptualize that? Is actually one of the root points of this exercise. And I think the selection of variables exactly. I mean, we're doing this on a cross-country aggregate scale, and it may actually be that it's very country-specific. And you may have to think that in some contexts, like selecting on, for example, education, because we were talking about it, may not have the same, like the relationship between education and contraceptive empowerment may not be monotonic. It's not that like higher education as always implies higher contraceptive empowerment. And in that case, I would actually say that for that particular variable, a cross-country comparison should not include education as part of its selecting mechanism. But this is actually bringing the field out to ask ourselves, how do we conceptualize contraceptive empowerment, and what are the features that go into that ideal? I think that I just even asking that question, the fact that we're discussing contraceptive empowerment, already I feel like that I've served part of a purpose, right? Whether it's the right purpose or not, or like how we're actually operationalizing it is, I think, up for debate, and there are people here far smarter than myself on thinking about what contraceptive empowerment means and how there's variation, either within country, across country, even within country, so much internal variation. How do we actually operationalize that, and at what point are we no longer tolerant of comparison? Yeah.
I have to take a pause and give the audience a choice. We either stop the discussion now and listen to Aparna's paper, or if you make the decision, we can't discuss anything with Aparna or ask questions. I don't want to be unfair to, so I'm leaving it to your choice. How do we want to spend this time, since we are on a interesting track of discussion? And we have a show of hands. How many want to continue this discussion? How many would like to hear Aparna's paper?
I think I think we could hear Aparna's paper, and we can always come back to questions,
Okay,
right? Because
great.
I think it would be unfair to
It's a 15-minute
like
event.
run out of time, I think, for
Yeah.
her. Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
go to Aparna's paper.
Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aparna Jain, and I am a senior associate with the Population Council. I'm sorry I'm unable to be with you all today, but I'm very excited about the opportunity to still be able to present through this pre-recorded session. So thanks to the organizers for arranging that. Today, I will present on the behalf of my co-author on fertility intention, motivation to prevent pregnancy, and contraceptive use. So quickly, fertility intentions change over time, and previous research have shown that they can even change in relatively short periods of time. Fertility intentions coupled with inconsistent contraceptive method use leads to increased risk of unintended pregnancy. Fertility intentions have been shown to predict future fertility behaviors, and this has been done and demonstrated through longitudinal studies. So also, fertility intentions can predict future contraceptive use. I'd just like to emphasize, though, that it's really important that as we start thinking more and more about client-centered, rights-based approaches, to consider contraceptive continuation of any method versus simply of method-specific continuation. Many of you know what the unmet need definition is. Women's stated fertility intentions are combined with their current contraceptive method use. The question is, why do women who report a desire to limit or delay fertility not use contraception to support these desires and to prevent unintended pregnancy? What role can an indicator like motivation to prevent pregnancy have? It hasn't been considered currently in the current measure. And also, the undecided category about whether or when a woman wants to have another child, that category is typically combined with those who want in more than 2 years, according to the DHS definition. So the purpose of our study today was to answer a couple of questions. First, does adding a question on motivation to prevent pregnancy help explain why women might not be using a contraceptive method, even when they have expressed a desire to limit or space their fertility? Does it improve the predictability of fertility intention? Second, we were interested in exploring the undecided fertility intention category. Remember, that is those who say that they're undecided about whether or when to have a child. Typically, undecided responses are either removed completely from the analysis or combined with wanting more children. So we were interested in unpacking that a little bit further. So the data for these analyses come from a 1-year prospective study of recent PP-IUD, interval IUD users, injectable users, and pill users. The overall sample is nearly 2,700 women. They are currently married women between the ages of 15 and 49, living in Odisha and Haryana. And as you can see, we interviewed them at 4 points in time: at enrollment, 3, 6, and 12 months after enrollment. So the sample population that we have, so we looked at women who completed the 3-month interview, so interview time point 2, and also had a repeat interview 12 months after the enrollment. So the observation duration for this sample is approximately 9 months, and it includes 2,200 women of the original sample. Of these 2,200 women, roughly 12% had discontinued contraception. So our measures come from respondent characteristics, which we take at enrollment. At 3 months, we have fertility intentions and motivation to prevent pregnancy. And at 12 months, we have our modern method use/non-use. So the independent variables, again, collected at 3 months include fertility intentions collected in the standard way. Would you like to have would you like to have a or another child? If so, how long would you like to wait from now before the birth of a child? Would you like the birth of a child to take place in the next year, within 1 to 2 years from now, or more than 2 years from now? And motivation to prevent pregnancy was also collected at 3 months. And this was collected on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is extremely important and 1 is not important at all. We asked, how important is it to you to avoid a pregnancy now? And we combined the responses into low, medium, and high. So you'll see that this is a highly motivated group. The independent variables were combined fertility intentions and motivation to prevent pregnancy at 3 months. We basically constructed an 8-category variable, which included 1, a woman does not want any more children and has low motivation to prevent pregnancy. 2, does not want any more children and a medium-high motivation. 3, wants a child in 2 years and low motivation. 4, wants a child in 2 years and medium-high motivation. 5, wants a child in less than 2 years and low motivation. 6, wants a child in less than 2 years and medium-high motivation. And then 7, 8 are the undecided categories. Our dependent variable is contraceptive use of any modern method at 12 months follow-up interview. This includes women who may have continued to use the same method through the study duration and women who may have switched to a different modern method. So women at 3 months in the sample could be modern method users or non-modern method users. By 12 months, contraceptive use of any modern method includes contraceptive continuation and restart, since all women were modern method users at enrollment. So for these analysis, I'll first present some Sankey diagrams, which are descriptive statistics of changes in fertility intentions and motivations to prevent pregnancies across all 4 interview times. Bivariate analysis of 3-month fertility intention and 3-month motivation with 12-month contraceptive use, and multi-logistic regression models with random effects to account for clustering at the individual level. So this is the first Sankey diagram, and this is the individual level changes in fertility intentions over time for the 4 time points. And what you can see here is that there is a significant amount of movement amongst the population in the sample between states and stages. I think it's important here to show that among women who were said that they did not want to have any more children at enrollment, a significant portion of them move out of that state at some point during the duration. Also, cross-sectionally, it would seem that these are very stable states, but when you look at it at an individual level, that's where you can start seeing the movement. And change can happen in a relatively short period of time. This next slide shows the individual level changes in motivation to prevent pregnancy. And as I mentioned, at 3 months, it was a very high motivation level. And again, this is probably because we had a sample population of predominantly users. But needless to say, there is still some movement out of high, out of medium, and out of low. This graph shows respondent characteristics of our analytic sample. As you can see, we have a relatively young population with over 73% under the age of 30. Most had some level of education. And by and large, nearly everyone had at least one living child. Most, 60% did not want to have any more children. And like I said, 63% also were high motivators to prevent pregnancy at 3 months. So this is the relationship between motivation to prevent pregnancy by fertility intentions at 3 months. And as expected, women who have stronger desires to prevent or delay pregnancy are more likely to be high motivators. And you see that in the first 2 columns on the left. What's interesting, though, is that those who are undecided about when and whether to have a child, they are more similar in terms of their motivation to prevent pregnancy to those who don't want to have any more children or want more children in more than 2 years at 59%. These data show modern method use at 12 months by fertility intentions and motivation. And what you can see here is at 12 months, 80% were using a modern method. And many, again, when you look at fertility intentions, the undecided who are using are more similar to those who don't want any more children and want in more than 2 years. And in terms of motivation, you see a gradient where low motivators are less likely to use a modern method compared to medium and high. These are the modern method users at 12 months by the overall combined fertility intention and motivation variable. And here what you can see for every category of fertility intention, medium to high motivators are more likely to use a modern contraceptive method at 12 months compared to low motivators. And again, that's true for all of the individual fertility intention categories. We also constructed some adjusted odds ratios of modern method use at 12 months. And we conducted 2 models. In the first model, we added fertility intentions and motivation to prevent pregnancy as 2 independent variables. These models are all adjusted for age, education, and number of living children. What you can see here is that relative to women who want a child within 2 years, those who want no more children, want a child more than 2 years, or undecided, are nearly 2.5 times more likely to be using a contraceptive method at 12 months. In terms of motivation, again, we see that high and medium and high motivators are 1.5 times more likely to be using modern contraception at 12 months. So in this one, we combined fertility intentions to be less than 2 years against everybody else, because limiters and spacers of 2 years and undecided were very, very similar. And here what you can see is that those who want a child in less than 2 years and are high, medium motivators, they are more likely to use, but that's not statistically significant. But those who want no more children, want in 2 years, or are undecided, and are either low motivators or medium and high motivators, they're more likely to be using a contraceptive modern method at 12 months. We also tested the difference between low and medium high motivation among those who want no more children, want a child in more than 2 years, and undecided by rerunning the model, but changing the reference category to medium high motivation in women who want. And what we found was that women with low motivation in this group were 31% less likely to use a modern method at 12 months compared to medium and high motivators. I haven't shown those data here, but just wanted to mention that. So across all 4 fertility intention categories, in summary, women with medium to high motivation to prevent pregnancy were more likely to use modern contraception 9 months later than women with low motivation. Adjusted multivariate models showed that the fertility intention and motivation independently influence modern method use at 12 months. The combined variable of fertility intention, and motivation showed that among women who want a child soon, those with medium and high motivation are more likely to use a modern method than those with low. But this association was not statistically significant. Among those who want a child in more than 2 years, those who want so among those who want a child in more than 2 years, those who want no more children or are undecided, women with medium and high motivation were more likely to use a contraceptive method 12 months later. The undecided responses were similar to those who want to space or limit fertility. So several limitations of this study include that in order to be enrolled in the panel, women had to be reversible modern method users at enrollment. Motivation to prevent pregnancy was relatively high at the beginning of the study, but motivation changed in short periods of time, as we saw in the Sankey diagrams. The analytic sample at 3 months included a very small proportion of non-users, where only 12% of the sample were non-users at 3 months or were recent discontinuers. So needless to say, with those limitations, the study still does demonstrate that motivation to prevent pregnancy improves the predictability of fertility intentions. But these data and this analysis, this question should be replicated in a general population with a panel of both users and non-users to further explore the implications of including a motivation variable. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. Are there questions that arise from Aparna's formulation of motivation and the discussions that we've had so far that I'd like the speakers, presenters to kind of grapple with that, right? I just don't want that presentation to hang.
Yeah. I just add more of a comment. Like, if I had to ever think about when to use fertility preferences or contraceptive preferences, working it in a panel is the way that I would do it. I don't think that there's, I'm going to take an extreme view, but I think that one has to kind of take a stance in advancing the field a little bit on what the measurement means. But I see little to almost no value using the fertility preferences or contraceptive preferences in a cross-section. So, especially for population level inference.
For population level, okay. I actually, seeing the Aparna's presentation, I was thinking about the first question about the ambivalence, which I think it's very nicely shown how that's changing from in the panel. And I think the question still remains, whether this at the population level, how much it influences the population level indicators. And that's something which I think we need to discuss. Mm-hmm. And it's also part of that ambivalence of, is the women who are ambivalent, is it that they have a no use of contraception? Is it a different methods? Is it traditional methods? How is it included in that unmet need indicator? And the similar things. It's
I'm glad you mentioned the ambivalence in the Sankey diagram, because I wish that there was a Sankey diagram for explaining all these transitions in states, because I just was doing as Aparna was presenting the Sankey diagram, I was just adding up just doing a rough addition of each of the different states. If you didn't have this panel, and if you actually just presented it all as a cross section, you would actually see that fertility preferences are incredibly stable. It would actually show very little variation across these different states at a population level. But if you actually see this at an individual level, there's significant variation across even a 1 year period. If you were to actually measure individual level preferences and individual level behavior over multiple points in the same period. So I just wanted to pick up how much variation is being masked at the population, using population level parameters and statistics relative to individual level parameters that everybody wants to generate inference for. So.
Comments from the audience. Anyone wants to express a view, ask a question? Go ahead.
I was just thinking about the. Yeah, yeah, I'm here. So I was just thinking about also this difference between fertility preferences and contraceptive preferences. So where you may really want to limit or delay, but there's not a method that's acceptable to you, or other reasons that you don't want to use, and then how we factor that in. I think it's another complicated question to grapple with. I was wondering, in a Purnam's presentation, it could have been an interesting additional piece to think through. But anyway, that's just what I'm sort of thinking about. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if we actually asked whether women want to use contraception or not. I just like to start there, like before we do anything further. But before we start talking about like whether they're using or not using, we should find a way of asking.
Any other thoughts? So I believe the IUSSP is planning to constitute some kind of a committee to further this line of work and thinking. And one of the thoughts that from a programming perspective and looking at the emerging landscape of where the future of contraceptive technology is moving, the boundaries between what constitutes an abortion and what constitutes contraception is incrementally going to get blurred in the very nature of the technology itself, right? And when you start looking at that potential, and possibly more countries being less concerned about population as a problem, right? The sense of the unmet need measure has survived and thrived in a context where the global community has been concerned about population growth, right? And when we look at these measures being applied to geographies where that is not true, and in fact the state provides other kinds of incentives to, we probably need to start up. I like the idea of moving towards Mahesh, your concept, right? I mean, so are we moving away from the need to measure prevalence and then a whole new indicator rather than at all focus on prevalence? Because if the conditions are good enough, the outcome should be good enough.
That's a good thought. Yeah.
So this is a thought which goes actually with Mahesh's presentation. And so I was a little bit, I have to say, bothered by thinking that there exists a part of the society which has the ideal contraceptive use and that we can actually assign characteristics to them. And it's something which kind of, where it's, I know you don't like the preferences, but the preference is part of the rights-based approach, is the intentions fulfillment. And so it's something which, to me, why we should think that these women are the part of this ideal contraceptive society, and also in any way, how to create that ideal. That's very complex, and I think we get to some issues which has, again, different kinds of the issues to our unmet need for family planning issues, so we just go from one to another issues. And just Mahesh, I kind of like, now I want to talk a little bit from my perspective of working on the global monitoring of the indicators, including the SDG indicator 3.7.1. And I think we need to understand that one of the very important aspects is that this is the indicator which we have, which is available, it's measured. We have a long period of the time now, close to 30 years of data availability. It is comparable because we invested as a community quite a lot of time in kind of seeing how even the surveys from the 1990s could be recalculated using the consistent measures. We have the global data sets, we have estimates. And I have to say, it's very important to actually have the indicator, which is where the data are available, and where we can talk about the country differences and the trends over time. Because these are the indicators which at the end gets picked up from these 170 indicators in SDGs and are mentioned in the reports, because we can actually say something. And and I kind of just feeling, that none of the indicators can ever be perfect. And there is always these different dimensions where we need to think, are they actually answering the target which you want to measure in that SDG? Is it measurable? Is it available? Is it timely? Because some of the indicators are not timely. So we described the situation 7-10 years ago. And so I think, it's always thinking it's none of the indicators, it's perfect, but it's kind of when we think about what we want with the unmet need as a next step, it's important to keep this in mind. Yeah. That's
so. No, Vladimir, I'm glad that we're having this discussion because actually one thing I just wanted to clarify, and I think if I hadn't clarified it before, I want to make absolutely clear. I am not against preferences. I'm against preferences that are measured in a cross-section where we don't understand the implicit or explicit magnitude and direction of the biases and that are generated from their problematic use. And what I think hopefully I was conveying this is that given the import of unmet need in programs and in policy and in planning and the amount of budgets that have gone to set unmet need. I mean, everywhere we go, almost every single session has unmet need mentioned somewhere as the key motivation as for whatever effort is being exercised. The fact that it is using such a biased approach where we don't actually understand and especially once we go beyond we've had about an hour and 20 minutes as researchers, a lot of us, to actually sit and think through these conceptual distinctions and differences. But once it goes beyond our hands to policy and practice, these conversations and understanding the limitations are not possible. So as much as I'm absolutely someone to think about generalizability and thinking about cross-country comparisons, and I think that there's tremendous value in the utility of metrics for that type of programming and planning over countries, over space, over time. But when we do it, we need to make sure that we are actually able to do those comparisons that are consistent and that are fair, because there is an import to what those comparisons mean. And if we don't understand the biases that we generate from making those comparisons and those inferences, then we actually risk there are many unintended consequences. And in this case, I have all these, this is where I think that, good intentions, even though we have, my main point in the beginning was it exists, but we're trying to put a Band-Aid on an issue where there's something that is more systemically problematic, where it may be cancerous.
So we're out of time.
Yeah.
And it's been a great conversation. I want to be provocative, not for the sake of being provocative.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't reinvent ourselves to respond to where there is need to kind of start thinking at least afresh and new, and worship at the altar of what has always been, we will never allow ourselves the possibility to imagine something different. And I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge what you said and say what measures may still need to kind of continue, but we cannot continue with just the same, right? And I think at least the beginning of pilot studies at some scale in some geographies, experimenting with new measures is an essential thing for our field at this point of time. So I'll just leave it over there, and I know this is not a verdict, but a dialogue and a conversation. So thanks a lot to the panelists, thanks a lot to the audience, and thanks a lot to the technical team that's been supporting a rather complex show here. So thank you, everyone.
Great.